And at this time, I'll begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Dan Goldhaber. Dr. Goldhaber is the Director of the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data and Education Research at the American Institutes for Research, and he's also the Director of the Center for Education Data and Research at the University of Washington Bothell. Dan's work focuses on issues of educational productivity and reform at the K-12 level, a broad array of human capital policies that influence the composition of distribution and quality of teachers in the workforce, and connections between students and K-12 experiences and their post-secondary outcomes. We're very excited to have Dan with us today, and at this time, I'll give you Dan.
Great, and thank you for the nice introduction. I hope everyone out there had a nice Halloween. I can tell you that I'm a little hopped up on leftover Halloween candy, so hopefully that won't make me less coherent than normal, whether that's good or bad. So I'm going to be talking mainly about teachers and the adoption of evaluation systems that recognize the differences that exist between them. And it sort of goes without saying, I think, just from personal experiences, that you can tell when you interact with teachers that they actually do differ quite a lot in ways. They differ substantially from one another and in ways that likely impact student achievement. And the research that's gone on over the last decade or so has made that abundantly clear empirically as well. So, I think what people experience in their day-to-day lives is now validated by research. And yet, what we see is that most systems today don't really recognize the differences that exist between teachers that affect student learning. So I'm thinking here of the licensure systems, the tenure systems, the evaluation systems, the credentials that we use to determine teacher compensation. So the idea for a lot of the experimentation that has taken place in this country around educator evaluation systems is to have the new systems, in fact, recognize these differences that exist between teachers. Most current evaluations and evaluation systems are pretty limited for reasons that I will describe in a moment. So why focus on teachers? Well, one of the things that we know is that when you narrow down what are the things that schools can do to improve student achievement, that teachers look like they are really very, very important. And one of the ways that you judge this in terms of statistics is what happens if you change from one teacher to another, and usually statisticians measure things in standard deviation units. So what is the impact of a standard deviation change in who you have as your teacher? And just by way of background, one standard deviation is roughly the difference between a person who is sort of in the middle of a teacher performance or teacher effectiveness distribution and somebody who is at the 84th percentile. And I'll talk more about this as well. So research suggests that one standard deviation change is roughly equivalent to a change in class size of 10 to 13 students. So that's an extraordinarily large change in class size. We don't see that magnitude of change take place, and it is a magnitude that would be very expensive to implement were we to try and change class sizes by that amount. I mentioned already that many of what economists tend to think of as the inputs that are used to measure teacher quality or effectiveness are really only weakly linked to teacher performance in the classroom, typically as measured by student achievement on standardized tests. So while it's not a new finding for researchers, I find that policymakers and practitioners are generally surprised, for instance, when you tell them that a teacher having a master's degree versus not doesn't look like it is generally predictive of how effective that teacher is likely to be. That often comes as a surprise. But that's what I mean when I say there's a weak link between these kinds of measures and student learning. Master's degrees are used in most school systems to help determine teacher pay. I should mention that as I'm clicking through these slides, that there are citations for, I'll try and distinguish between what is my opinion versus what is kind of empirical fact. And for everything that is empirical fact, there are citations, and when you look at the presentation at the end, you can get all the details, because I'll be glossing over a lot of them. So what I'm about to show you is a picture of measured teacher performance in Washington State. And the way to read this is in Washington, we estimated at the elementary level the value added for all of the teachers who are in tested grades and subjects. And value added is a particular type of, it's a particular measure of it's student growth measure. So basically, it's a measure where you're assessing teachers based on the achievement gains of the students that she has in her classroom. And there are various varieties of these value-added measures, and they tend to correlate reasonably strongly depending on how one implements the model. But basically, when we stack teachers up in Washington from least effective, and that's the left-hand side of this chart, so those teachers at 0, and then move to most effective, so along the horizontal axis going to the right, student achievement, which is this red line, goes up. And so on the vertical axis, student achievement is shown. And the things to note about this figure is not so much right now how student achievement is, it turns out it's measured in standard deviations of student test performance. But the important thing to me about this figure is that we've not only measured what does the model suggest about the achievement that students would gain associated with being with a particular teacher, and it's centered around 0, where 0 is the average achievement gain. Does not mean that students in the average classroom gain 0 points on the state test, but it's the average gain. It is that all of the teachers who are in the shaded red area, those are teachers for whom we're pretty confident, based on statistical significance, that they are less effective than the average teacher in the workforce in Washington State. And all the teachers that are in the green shaded area, those are teachers for whom we're pretty confident that their students are gaining more than the average teacher in the state. The state, typically, it has historically not used this kind of information in assessing teachers. It's not used for the professional development. It's not used for determining pay. It's not used for determining who is licensed. So there's a disconnect between the information that we know statistically about teachers and the personnel systems that inform anything about how we utilize teacher skills. One of the ways that statisticians often describe these kind of findings is to put teachers on a bell distribution. And so if I take that prior slide and I turn it into a bell curve, and 0, again, now on the horizontal axis is a teacher of average effectiveness, then you get a nice bell-shaped distribution of effectiveness in the workforce. And this may be the kind of picture you would have seen when you look at the height of people in the population. And again, a 1 standard deviation change in effectiveness is pretty important. one standard deviation change in teacher effectiveness is associated with about 18% of a standard deviation change in student learning on standardized tests. That's 4.5 months of student learning. And it's twice the difference we typically see between affluent students who are not eligible for free and reduced price lunch and students that are higher poverty and are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. So I say all this to say teacher effectiveness and the difference between teachers, very, very important. So I can already tell that I'm behind where I want to be in terms of the presentation, but I want to just quickly say that that the current systems, again echoing what I said before, really fail to act on these kind of differences that exist. I'll give you a specific example. Here is that same kind of Bell distribution for performance of teachers who in North Carolina either pass, which is the solid line, or fail teacher licensure exams. And the teachers who failed the line fail on these licensure exams is the dotted line. And just like you might see that there's a difference in average heights in the population with the dotted line might be women versus men, there's also a lot of overlap in these distributions. So there are lots of women who are taller than the average man and lots of men who turn out to be shorter than the average woman. Same thing ends up coming up here in the case of licensure tests. So the difference between F and P, that's the average difference in performance for teachers who fail or pass these licensure tests. And this average difference is, in fact, statistically significant. So if you are going to, if you have no information, but you just know, does the teacher pass or fail a licensure test, who would you bet on? Well, you would bet on the teacher that passed. That would be the teacher whose students would tend to gain more on standardized tests. But all of the teachers who fall into the B part, the green shaded area of the distribution, those are teachers that don't do very well on these licensure tests, but in fact turn out to be more effective than the average teacher who they fail the test. They don't do very well, but they turn out to be more effective than the average teacher who passed. And all the teachers in area A, those are teachers who do well on these tests, but turn out to be less effective based on value-added metric than the average teacher who failed the test. So the point here is there is a lot of overlap in these distributions, and we can learn about teachers based on their in-service evaluations and try and address those differences. But the licensure test, it predicts something, but it doesn't predict a huge amount of how effective one teacher is likely to be versus another, at least at the elementary level. There is a very famous, pretty simple but interesting article called The Widget Effect. And what the widget effect shows, this is a TNTP study of teacher in-service evaluations in a variety of districts. And what it shows is that most teachers get the same performance evaluation. So when you actually go out and you survey school districts and you say, how many teachers were satisfactory versus unsatisfactory? How many teachers were very effective, highly effective, ineffective, etc.? So most teachers fall into the same category. And I'll just show you a little bit about this. This is now a relatively old study, but when this study came out in 2009, in the districts that were surveyed, when districts had a binary system, you're satisfactory or unsatisfactory, 99% of the teachers showed up as being satisfactory. When systems had somewhat more nuanced categories, it was, I'm adding this up quickly in my head, 99% of the teachers fell into the upper two categories. You're highly effective or you're effective. So even though a nuanced system allows you to be more nuanced, as would be suggested by the title, you're still getting most of the teachers that are clustered at the very top of the distribution. Now, I don't emphasize that because I think that teachers ought to be, more teachers necessarily ought to score near the bottom of whatever performance system you have. But it turns out that these upper two tiers, you can't take any personnel actions based on those upper two tiers. And I also want to be clear that when I talk about personnel actions, that the personnel actions could be high stakes. They could be you receive tenure or you don't, but they also could be actions that just informed like the kind of professional development that a teacher gets, at least in terms of saying to a teacher, look, you're not sort of meeting the need right now, so we're hoping you could get professional development in these particular areas. You can't actually do that in any kind of enforceable way if the evaluations are not reflecting the assessment of the teachers. So one of the questions that you may see up on your screen, I actually don't see it anymore, but one question that I think would be good to think about is whether the new systems of evaluation are actually going to do a better job of differentiating teachers, better job than these old systems did, and if so, why or why not? I think that is a really fundamental question that gets at the heart of a lot of the education reform that we see going on today. And so I'm going to kind of look and see if people are typing in responses as I go through the rest of the presentation. So I've kind of hinted at this, that there are a variety of ways that you could use individual teacher performance evaluations. In theory, if we figured out that teachers look like they are doing well in some areas of an evaluation and poorly in others, then it might inform the kind of professional development that they get. It might inform teacher training. But it can only inform those things, again, if there's some differentiation between teachers. Because if the evaluation says all teachers are the same, we cannot act on it. It also might be used by school systems to think about, who do we recruit, retain, select, etc. And then there are a whole bunch of high stakes uses that tend to get a lot of the focus and why there's a lot of controversy around teacher evaluation reform. So for instance, it might inform which teachers are laid off, which teachers are tenured or licensed, those kind of employment and pay kind of areas. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of these ways that teacher evaluations might be used and kind of what we know currently about from research about how effective they might be. So I mentioned, for instance, that they might be used to inform teacher training, pre-service training, and school system selection. I actually think we know very little about those things. So there's no slides up here about that. But there's been a lot of research on teacher professional development. I guess I'd characterize it as weak. Some, weak in terms of showing effects. Some of the rigorous evaluations suggest that very targeted kinds of professional development of a particular form can be effective. But when you look more broadly at do investments in professional development seem to be paying off, my read on the literature is that it looks like that they generally are not. I'd argue that one of the reasons why that PD doesn't look like it's terribly effective is because a lot of the PD that is received is not targeted to individual teachers. I'm just glancing at some of the discussion. So Nancy, for instance, says that she thinks much of the effectiveness of evaluation systems depend on the training of evaluators, whether they're administrators or peer observers, and I think that is absolutely true, and that's an implementation challenge. I would also kind of use that point to note that a lot of states and school districts, they are combining different forms of evaluation, and oftentimes they're combining them by attaching weights to the different forms. So the school system will say something like, we're going to have, if you fall in a tested grade and subject, we're going to have 30% of your evaluation be based on, some student growth value-added metric. Maybe 50% of it will be based on classroom observations, and another 20% maybe has to do with student growth objectives or principal evaluations or something else. And I think it's easy for policymakers to think that because there are different weights attached to it, that is actually what's driving the summative evaluation of teachers. But it's really important to consider that it is both the weight and the amount that the measure varies that's going to determine how much the different components contribute to the summative rating. So as a for instance, if all classroom observations say that teachers are the same, then even if a classroom observation has 50% of the weight in determining summative evaluations, then effectively classroom observations are not contributing at all to the differences in categorization, performance categorization of teachers. So value added is a very controversial area, and what I often say to policymakers and practitioners who might be skeptical about value added is that if you're skeptical, you ought to be pushing for more differentiation along the other ways, the other kinds of components of teacher evaluation. Because if you don't have differentiation in a classroom observation or student growth objective, then it is the student test outcomes, the value added, that is contributing all of the power in differentiating teachers. And so I think that in terms of implementation and making sure that things are done, not just sort of out of compliance, it's really important that people get that message, that if you want other parts of an evaluation to be taken seriously, then those parts have to actually reflect the differences that observers might be seeing between teachers. And a lot of that is going to be about the kind of training and the message that's delivered on the ground. It's not about the design of the system as a whole. Another area where people try and influence teacher effectiveness is by tying evaluations to teacher pay. So, one of the high stakes ways that that teachers might be rewarded. And a lot of the studies about pay for performance tend to be of a particular variety. Teacher pay is connected to, the average performance gains of students. And, a decade ago, I would have said, I think we ought to be trying these things. I think this sort of simple way of trying to encourage greater performance out of existing teachers doesn't look all that promising today. And there are a lot of reasons why that may be the case. One of the reasons is that you probably want to think about those kind of incentives in a broader context. So do you have incentives in place? Do teachers actually get nuanced feedback about their performance? Do you have data systems that help support the overall system that are believable? I also think, I noticed there's a comment from Kathy. The second bullet, more promising, implies that the experimental research is wrong. Do you have a let me just talk a little bit about this. So there's both experiments where teachers are given performance bonuses on an experimental basis. There's a treatment and control group, and it's clear to everybody involved that it's an experiment. And there's also non-experimental studies, and actually one of the most important non-experimental studies is a recent one that looks at the impact system in Washington, D.C. And I think there are some reasons to think that the experimental and non-experimental results might yield different findings. Not necessarily that one study is wrong and one study is right, but people could behave differently because they know that there is an experiment. Also, some of the non-experimental studies are set in the context, again, of a more holistic reform of, curriculum, feedback, evaluation, and incentives. Whereas the experimental studies tend to be focused on a particular kind of pay for performance. So it's not a one is right or one is wrong. It is that you might expect differential results depending on the nature of the system that is being evaluated. The other thing that I think is important to consider when thinking about how performance evaluations are used is whether you are focused on improvements of existing teachers versus improvements in the teacher workforce that may come out of changing who actually is in the workforce. And this sort of goes to the theory of action around performance evaluation and how it's going to be used. So as a for instance, there are a number of simulation studies that suggest that if you use performance evaluation in the context of thinking about which teachers are laid off or which teachers lose their license or are not tenured, they suggest really, really big effects on student achievement. But you'd want to be careful about how the inferences you draw from those kind of simulations, because they don't consider sort of the behavioral impact of the system. So for instance, let's say that the teachers that are judged to be at the bottom of the distribution for over the course of a couple of years, that those teachers are not tenured. As is the plan, at least according to some states and their new systems of educator evaluation and consequence. Well, the simulations suggest that could have a profound effect on student achievement. But what those simulations don't tell you is if you make teaching a less desirable profession because it looks less secure, what would that do to the front end of the teacher pipeline? Might you get less skilled people who would choose to enter the teaching profession? That is possible. And at this point, we really don't know much about whether that would happen, because we can't evaluate those kind of behavioral responses until we actually see programs in place. So I'm getting toward the end of my time, but still not really the end of my slides. So let's see. I want to emphasize this point about differentiation, that what research has taught us over the last decade is that there are huge differences in teachers, and the systems we have in place, they just don't recognize them. So I think that until we get to a place where evaluation systems begin to recognize them, we shouldn't expect a strong connections between those evaluation systems and student achievement. I also would put out there that we probably need, for at least some theories of action, for the evaluation system to provide concrete and timely feedback to teachers, especially if your theory of action is that evaluation is going to be connected to changing the performance of teachers who are in the workforce. And because we care about behavioral response, do teachers actually act on the evaluations that they receive in ways that are productive? That's really, really important for them to believe that the system has integrity, that this is just not mumbo-jumbo where, student achievement was put into a processor and some numbers were popped out that didn't really mean anything. I think that if this becomes a compliance exercise, then it's not going to have the kind of, we're not going to see the kind of change that we would want to in terms of connecting the evaluations to improve student learning. So the last thing that I guess I want to emphasize in wrapping up is that when it comes to discussions about educator evaluations and changes and connecting the educator evaluations to to human capital policies like tenure, licensure, et cetera. We tend to sort of think about it as if those are we're making these things high stakes. And I guess what I would point out is that we have high stakes policies in place today. Teachers are only eligible to teach if they pass licensure exams and go to approved programs, training programs. Those are high stakes. Teachers' pay is connected to their experience and their degree level almost everywhere. Those are high stakes policies connected to credentials and characteristics about teachers. So I think in thinking about change, we don't want to think, oh, the change brings about high stakes, but compare the stakes connected to the idea of change to the existing high stakes policies that we have today. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Dan.